a view of what immersion is, and particularly, I think what I'm really going to talk about, so the take-home message is about the nature of the immersive experience and how large-scale interactive artworks, installations, things like that, can use interactive interfaces and so on, and how they can be made to be immersive as opposed to sort of the standard mouse keyboard screen type of interface, which I don't personally feel very immersive, but is very immersive, but we'll come to that point. So the talk's really in two parts, a bit of theory and then some particular devices from a fairly long period of history, about the last 35 years. Is that right? 25 years. And bringing it up to sort of current virtual reality works and large-scale installation works and things. So basically, what we do in the world is we interact with it. We are part of the world, and so interaction is what we do. It's the way we are in the world, but we're immersed in the world. It's our condition. We're in the world at all times, and it's impossible to extract ourselves from it other than through death or maybe through some kind of enlightenment or something like that. So the knowledge we have of the world in which we're immersed is not a true knowledge, but it's a construction based on our interaction and whatever it is that is actually out there. We don't know, it's quite impossible for us to know what the real physical world is. What we live in is a world of constructed, experienced construction. It's a virtual world that we live in all the time. We'll come to a point further down where I talk about virtual a bit more. But at the moment, what we know of the world is virtual, and because it's an accumulation of all the constructions of all experiencing minds that have endured in the world and have influenced the culture of the world. So anybody who's ever written something down or made an artwork or anything like that that's contributed to your perception of the world, your experience of the world, has engaged in the construction of your world. So we are immersed in this situation at all times, and then immersion in virtual reality experiments and installations and things like that is a second order immersion on this basis. So our world, the world that we know and experience and the world to which we attribute the term the real world, is a first order immersion. It's a first order reality, virtuality. And the virtual world, the virtual reality world, the world of the large-scale games and things like that, the world of pieces like Shah Davies, Osmos, all of that kind of experience is a second-order virtuality, second-order immersion. So our experience of the world is also an entirely private, constructed world, and what we communicate with the world, we can't communicate our subjectivity directly. We cannot pick up the contents of a brain or a mind and hand it to somebody else. All we can do is make representations and experiences that other people then interpret and read into the framework within which they live as their experience of your experience. So it's always virtualized. It's always removed from any kind of direct connection with reality. So the function of the interface is to immerse the user in some object, or of some object to which that interface belongs. It immerses them into a context defined by the object's function. An object here means simply some object of perception, because people also carry interfaces, as the word implies. An interface occurs between two surfaces. the faces of the people involved in a conversation, or the control surfaces of pieces of equipment that one might be using. An interface is the channel by which one's intentions towards another person in the conversation or whatever are presented, or it's the means by which one conveys to a piece of equipment what one wants it to do. So an interface is that which operates between us and the object of our intentions, is the medium by which we convey those intentions, and most importantly, it's the means by which we gain feedback from the object so that we can continue to operate with it successfully. Interaction becomes immersive when we forget that we are interfacing with someone or something. In other words, when it becomes intuitive, when it goes sub-threshold, when we just forget that there's other stuff going on and we get really involved in the conversation, for example, or something like that. So in our day-to-day world, day-to-day activity in the world, we often become fully immersed in some process, forgetting the time or that there are others waiting for us or such like. That is, the space of our experience becomes the space of our existence for the duration of that experience in which we're immersed. Immersion is also what happens to us in the cinema when we are carried away by the film. Immersion is about forgetting ourselves and about becoming a part of something bigger. And again, a conversation, any kind of two-way interaction with another in which you become entirely involved in the interaction and forget about the rest of the world, that is an immersive experience. So in this way, worlds of virtual reality and the constructed worlds of our day-to-day experience can be seen to be one and the same, despite the apparent layers of separation wrought by the technology of VR. So the TV, for example, is not an interactive device, as most of us are pretty well aware. It's strictly one way, broadcast. Even if we are supposed to play happy nuclear families around it, the TV is a conversation stopper. And shouting back at it does not influence the newsreader. So there's nothing you can do to get back to what that person is saying to you or doing to you or whatever it is. And that other, absolutely these days ubiquitous form of interface, the mouse, which this is Douglas Engelbart's original mouse. This is the actual object, and you can see how it was organised. It's a pair of rotary wheels that do much along the lines of what the ball and spool rotary discs inside the modern mouse do. And this is this is actually the power supply and interface for the mouse. So you can see that things have become rather smaller and more efficient since then. That's a very clunky old interface as well. So, as it says, the mouse and the keyboard, although interactive, are about as exciting as knives and forks, which are also an interactive tool in a sense. They produce a private and rather mundane interaction, and often, certainly in my experience, and I'm sure in many of yours experience, they leave you cold when you're exploring a big interactive work or something like that. So it's just not a immersive thing. It doesn't drag you in and make you. I mean, sometimes it does. It does work sometimes, but mostly it's not very interactive. Not very immersive. I mean, there are other kinds of interfaces from the early days. This is a light pen on a Digital Equipment GT40 graphics display. This was from an exhibition in Australia in '75, and these kids are playing a game, one of the early computer games called Lunar Lander, and they're controlling the behaviour of the machine by dragging it around, of the landing device by dragging it around using the light pen. So that's another which has now disappeared completely. You find a light pen, it's a collector's item these days. This is another and really interesting thing. This is a digitizing pad, much like your Wacom tablet these days, but the pen had a pair of strings which attached to it, and by moving the pen around the tablet, you draw the strings out and get by mathematical triangulation, you get the location of the pen by the distance that the strings have been drawn out from their supplier. And you can also see that it's got a menu, set of menu buttons on here, which when the computer knows, just like the Wacom tablet can have an overlay put on it that has the, say, Autodesk, AutoCAD type of buttons and things like that on it. So these are basically very early approaches to doing interface devices of varying kinds. So coming back to some of the sort of basics and the theory of interfacing, I figure there are more or less 4 combinations of interfaces: person to person, which we'll elaborate on these a bit as we go. The person to machine, which is controlling the machine to person, which is essentially the feedback from the machine, and then of course there's machine to machine, which is really at very, very primitive levels these days in the sense of networking and interconnection and that sort of stuff. So person to person interfacing, essentially this is conversation, or conversation makes a good model of it, or any one of the other modes of interaction that we engage in when talking to each other or whatever. So I use the idea of a conversation between people because it covers a number of important points in interfacing. It's a mediated process of exchanging information and intention between individuals. It's mediated by sequences of signs, i.e. language, and signals, gestures, by which the exchange takes place. It's guided by feedback from whomever is the other in the turn-taking of conversation, and it's usually pretty immersive. So person to machine, one doesn't usually have conversations with machines, but I mean, it is slowly developing. So, but it's the use of the machine, it's the way you control the machine. In any number of situations, for example, driving a car, working with your computer, machining a new piece of metalwork or something like that, one needs to direct the process of what the machine is doing so that we can keep it doing what we need it to do with a minimum of fuss. This type of interface is, again, a mediated process, but here we're essentially telling the machine what we want it to do. So there's no interaction as such, except, there's no feedback from the machine as such. It is mediated by usually a fixed set of signs, the kinds of things that the machine is capable of doing. These signs are displayed on some sort of control panel or control surface. The control of the process is again by feedback, not only from the machine, but also from other persons and events around you, within the environment in which the machine is being operated. And it may or may not be immersive. And of course, we're talking about everything from a drill press through to, or a computer or something, through to a full-scale video game or something like that. These are all machines, and to what extent they're immersive is very largely dependent on the way the machine responds back to you. This points us to a criterion that one might use in evaluating the success of a machine and its interface, particularly where it is in some way an artwork or a performance instrument. And we're going to talk about these sorts of interfaces later on. Since immersion, being about forgetting, becomes a matter of losing oneself in the process, if the process of the work doesn't deeply involve the user, then one has to wonder to what extent the work has succeeded. For example, personally, I feel that the mouse keyboard screen interface, although it works very well for writing letters or even building director sequences like this, is hardly an involving immersive interface. As has become obvious, the immersive things like games often require extra hardware, for example joysticks or steering wheels. It is not that the mouse keyboard screen interface doesn't have the necessary buttons to shoot at the enemy. It is that the idea of using any of the 100 odd buttons on a keyboard simply doesn't engage you in the process, so you don't become immersed. Okay, machine-to-person interfacing. This version of the interfacing process is probably rather limited in the present era to what we have said about the function of feedback from the machine. It may well be that in the longer term, future machines actively engage us in conversation. and this will not be as astonishing as it might seem nowadays. Always supposing that we don't end up with a complement of subservient coffee makers with brains as big as a planet, if you're familiar with The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which some of you will be, I'm sure. So this really is about an emulation of the active presentation of behaviour by the other. The concept of machine-to-person interaction here would be like any person-to-person interaction that we might engage in these days, if once we get to this point of intelligent, responsive machines and so on. Machine-to-machine interaction is probably fairly recent and really only comes with the networks of interconnection between machines that we think of as data networks and that have become the internet. When and if artificial intelligence surfaces, then we will no doubt see machine-to-machine interaction of a similar type to what I've already covered under person-to-person interaction. So I'm going to illustrate a range of physically immersive interfaces which have been produced over the last 30 years to augment the performer's or the audience's interaction with instruments or artworks. Essentially, I'm going to talk about the hardware interface between a person, be they performer or audience, and the machines that are being used in that work. I'll look at a number of technical means of interfacing people to performance instruments and new media artworks, which range from analogue to digital technology, and from the personal to the large-scale public, from performance instrumentation to sensitive environments. But just to, as a sidebar, so to speak, just to point out the difference between analogue and digital, this waveform here is a continuous waveform, an analogue waveform. And as I say, analogue signals involve conveying the continuous variability of the real world, of the human world, to a device as a continuously varying voltage. Then if we sample that voltage at some clock rate, we can turn that voltage into a series of numbers. And what digital does is that it handles those sets of numbers so that we know that the variability is now in completely and perfectly reproducible sequences of numbers. And that's where the computer is able to manipulate those data and to use them in various ways to reproduce them identically at every instance, and so on. So we get into various people's actual devices, and I'm going to start with one of the most interesting and early interface devices, which was the theremin. And particularly the use of the theremin by a dancer called Philippa Cullen, who was a very innovative dancer in Australia in the early 70s. And sadly, she died in late 75. But she was responsible for a great deal of some of the most interesting and inspiring art and technology developments that took place in Australia in those early days. The theremin and the second thing from her, the pressure-sensitive floors, these are performance interfaces. They're used for controlling synthesizers by analog voltage control, and they're used for controlling computers by converting that analog signal to digital signals. So this is Philippa working with a particular kind of theremin. Do you know what a theremin is? The theremin's familiar to you? Because I can skip down a couple of pages to it and bring it up now, or we can talk. I'll mention it as I go through. But essentially, a theremin is an antenna that picks up the electrical capacitance of a body, of a human body, and by sensing that capacity, that sort of charge that a human body carries, it can vary a oscillator and thereby make tones and sounds, and of course those can be voltage controlled things for controlling other synthesizers and things. And so these are very large scale antennas. See these wires here, and they will allow a synthesizer or an oscillator to change its tone according to her placement against or within the vicinity of these things. They're non-contact. They don't have to be, you don't have to actually touch the wiring, the antennas. It's just a matter of your position in relation to it. This is another form of theremin. You can see that this shell-like thing here it's actually made of wire, and by the way she places her hands in its vicinity, they're setting it up at the moment. This is the guy who's actually built it. Manuel Noblenz is his name. So this is how theremin works. You've got two antennas, each of which controls an oscillator, and then the two oscillations, when the theremin has got nobody in its vicinity, it sits at a null or a neutral state, and the two oscillators are running at exactly the same frequency, so that if you mix the two oscillators together, they cancel each other out perfectly. When somebody moves, when the capacitance on the antenna changes, when somebody moves near one of the antennas, it changes the frequency of the oscillator. The two oscillators then beat, and you get a tone which is called a beat frequency tone, which can be then used to drive a synthesizer or as an actual tone in itself. So you remember in the Beach Boys' Good Vibrations, that I'm sorry, I can't sing. I won't even try. Sound that is made in that song is produced with the theremin. So that's the kind of sound that the theremin makes. This is the man who invented it, Leon Theremin, a Russian electronics wizard in the 30s and 40s. I think he built this in the 40s. And this is his theremin, and you can see the two antennas. And one was set up to control volume, and one was set up to control pitch. And this is a slightly more recently made theremin designed by Robert Moog, who built all the audio synthesizers subsequently. Again, you can see the, I'm not sure which is which, can I tell? Probably volume and pitch controls. This is another kind of theremin. This is a chap called Greg Schema. He's riding on a drum which has got an antenna built on it. When he stands on that drum and stands in a particular neutral position, well, they're standing straight up and down with his hands beside him, they can tune the oscillator so that it makes no sound. So that as soon as he moves, the sound starts. So he can actually control the way the sounds work from his motion, from his dance. These are more theremins. These are really very beautiful objects. They're big spheres of acetate with reflective metallized surfaces inside them. And these are, again, antennas. So any kind of metallized surface can be an antenna. These ones are a similar kind of concept, but they just executed differently. And so this Stanos Sterkotowski can control the music from from his synthesizers by people's movement, so that he can make big interactive spaces, or he can do a performance type of thing with it, or any sort of work with these because of the scale in which these are built. And these are just those square theremins from a slightly closer view, and you can see the guys are setting up the mixer and their synthesizer, or whatever that was. I wasn't there, so I don't know what exactly that machine was. But also at this exhibition called Australia 75, which was a Computers and Electronics in the Arts exhibition, it's very, very important within Australia, but I suspect no one else in the rest of the world even knew about it. Philippa Cullen had these triangular floors which had pressure sensors in them at each apex, so that if you moved across the floor, you would change the balance on the pressure sensors, and that way you could communicate that information to a computer and produce images. So you can see that they're dancing, they're moving on the floors, and then they're producing. This is the main image that's of interest to from the floor. The rest of the images are just video synthesized, colorized versions of camera off camera from the dancers. And so, but here you can see that there is actually, so to speak, a map of the history of the dancers' movement over the floor, so that where the dancers moved in one direction, the computer can track that movement and put a line in that direction. And so where the changes of weight on the floor by people's movement across it, this brings about these developing sort of history trace of the movement, and that's being then sent off to, that's being generated in a computer, tracked in a computer, and then sent off to a video colorizer to give it the colors and things like that. So again, the floors. And this is the actual technical arrangement of the whole operation. This was driven from a PDP-11, which, and these are the floors, and so we've got this connection to the computer through an analog to digital converter, and then the computer can talk through a big screen memory, and this is a very early large-scale screen memory, and it's built in a very early version of memory. This is before chip memory. This is core memory, ferrite core memory. So it's a screen memory in a box that big, not in your VGA card in the back of your machine, you know. And so the display memory can drive a video synthesizer, video processor, and be mixed to camera images. It could control the colorizing of the camera images, things like that, and displayed on a big wall of monitors. Or the data from the floors can be actually sent directly to a music synthesizer, and thus making the music. So the dancers can not only control their own pictures, they can control the sounds that are being used. So this is an interface between, it's a performance interface that allows people to control the actual accompaniment to the performance. So that it's a dance thing in which you can control the sounds and the visual display. Okay, we'll come into another one entirely. This is a performance instrument within the issue, within the sort of presence of a band. I was part of a band called Severed Heads in the 80s, which is a early electro dance sort of band, and it's in the sort of realm of New Order or Cabaret Voltaire or those English Sheffield-based bands. And we used a video synthesizer live on stage as part of the show, so that the performance was audio synthesizers and video synthesizer as live presence, mixing down video patterns, video colorizing. Never actually used camera on stage, but lots of bits of tape being mixed down and things like that. So the synthesizer was a pattern generator and vision mixer, video mixer in one package. Of course, you can buy all that really easily these days. You couldn't in those days. This was beginning of the 80s, this work. So this is the video synthesizer system that I had. The reason I want to talk about this kind of interface is that performance requires real-time responsivity in the machine. And for a long time, it was almost impossible to get real-time response out of a computer. You simply couldn't drive the music in real time. You had to pre-compose it. You couldn't drive the pictures in real time. You had to sit down and draw them up and go through the whole process of getting the machine to play them back, and it would do it slow and clunky, and except maybe the Amiga was better than most of the PCs or even the Mac. So real time for the first sort of 20 years of performance in electronic performance and that sort of stuff had to be done with analog machines. So, and this is essentially, these are analog machines. Basically, it's knobs and controls, sliders, so that you can actually move them around in real time, and that way, and get real-time response. It's instantaneous response. There's no latency that you have. None of this problem of waiting for the computer to sort of give you a return, a response. This is the video synthesizer. You can see that these are the input selection and channel selection for the mixer, and these are synthesizer, basically just audio synthesizer devices inside it, and they'll generate patterns. So that this is that box in an earlier version, but you can see that it's also hooked up to a big audio synthesizer, and the audio synthesizer will control the behaviour of the oscillators in the video synthesizer, and so it'll also, this box here is a colorizer, and the audio synthesizer can control the colorizer, so you'll get shifting colours and over the patterns, shifting patterns. They can be synchronous with the screen, in other words, they're sort of rectilinear, or they can be slewing all over the screen completely freely, random, and so that gives you a performance instrument, and that sort of capacity to do a performance in real time is one of the most important aspects of the interface as a sort of an immersive thing. You become involved rather than having to sort of do something, sit back and wait for the response. There's no latency. This is just a block diagram of the way the synthesizer worked. The switches are represented here, and the oscillators that were there, and these are the controls, so that you can see that it's just a real-time throughput into a big switching matrix, which is essentially a video mixer, and then out to the video display. This is just a photograph of us in performance, and we'll come to a bit of video of that performance, which will run for about a minute and a half, about 2 minutes. This was at a big concert, big rave party in beginning of 1990. If everything works all right. You can see I'm driving the video synthesizer, and there's tape material, and then all the pattern generated material colorized over the top. So the actual control is performance. It's real time. It's part of the show. Apart from the fact that I have my back to the audience most of the time. And of course, drumsticks on a drum machine of some sort are just as much a real-time control device or an interface as anything else. So that was Severed Heads, and essentially it was an electronic production band, much like Orbital or Prodigy or people like that these days. Audio synthesizers, video synthesizers, and very little of the sort of regular guitar band performative kind of thing that we were given a great deal of strife over the fact that we didn't have guitars and drums and all of that sort of screaming performance. But these days, of course, it's all completely acceptable. So it's just the way things change. So that's performance, and of both kinds. Performance in terms of dance and large-scale environments and things like that. And it's performance in sense of real-time musical performance and so on. We now start to talk more about artworks, installation, and that sort of thing. We talk particularly for the moment about virtual reality. Virtual reality is really your most immersive form, other than just the regular day-to-day immersion in the real world that we sort of normally understand, but completely, which is in a sense completely invisible to us because it's just our natural state of being. So virtual reality suffered sadly for a long time from a major problem. It was often not very much real time because of the latency and recalculating the point of view shot all the time. And this was often very difficult and confusing and caused a great deal of disorientation, and some people ended up with severe motion sickness and things like that. And it made virtual reality, really gave it a very, very difficult prognosis. So that to a large extent virtual reality has sort of disappeared off the map at the moment. And it's, I think with the latest machines we'll start to see it sort of coming back because the response time is much faster, but that latency caused it a real problem. So, as I say, it's the faster technology will and easier rendering will make it much more effective, I think. This is Ivan Sutherland's original head-up display. It was built in 1970, and it was originally, of course, used for military stuff and things like that, as just about everything in the way of computer history was originated through military work. And you can see that it's basically standard head-up display is stereo video, pair of monitors in front of the eyes, and headphones with some sort of in more recent times, the sort of spatialized audio that allows you to sort of place sounds very specifically in the environment. So I'll talk about Osmose briefly. This was probably just about the most successful VR piece ever made, it seems to me. Oh, so you know Osmose? Have you've all been introduced to it, have you? Or anyway, okay, well we'll skip through it quickly. But it was a very interesting experience to ride in Osmose. I tried to dive into the floor at one stage. Thank goodness. So I got really involved. I got totally immersed, and I forgot where I was, and I really literally tried to dive into the pool, into the stream that flows through it. So you can sort of see these little moats here streaming through, and I was trying to sort of dive into them, and it caused a certain amount of problem because the cabling, thank goodness, wouldn't let me smash the head-up display on the floor. Anyway, so you know about that, so we'll skip all that. Now, there are other kinds of physically immersive but non-virtual type interfaces, mouse enhancements of varying kinds, furniture and room scale installation work and that sort of stuff. This is a machine of mine. Basically, it's a well, the way I put it was that I was going to build, or trying to build, a mouse for Babbage's difference engine. Now, the difference engine is a 19th century proposal, and of which there were models built, but no finished version, not until 1996 anyway, of a computer. But it was built in brass and mechanical, completely mechanical componentry. So I sort of thought, well, now what would a control device for that, a mouse, be like for that machine? And so this is, in a sense, a reading table with a built in a sort of a steampunk kind of thematic. It's actually an old sewing machine, legs and stuff, brass bound table and monitor all sort of set up in brass and things. And these are the mouse components. It's a two-handed mouse, this one. This is the key, the clicker. It's an old Morse key. It's actually a brand new Morse key, but doesn't matter. It's exactly the same as an old Morse key. And it works, it's just a switch. It's the left button on the mouse. And it literally is the left button on the mouse, because what I did was I took the mouse electronics and just rewired it. And then just, so the computer just sees it as a mouse. It doesn't care at all. And this is the navigation, the ball, the movement. By rotating the wheel like that, you push the cursor up and down the screen so that you're doing this sort of work. By tilting the wheel, you actually, what you do is you switch on a little motor which provides an emulation of the rotation for the other dimension, for the X dimension as opposed to the Y dimension, so you can push the cursor along. And what it's done is that it gives you this very slow mouse thing. You sit down, you've got time to read, you've got time to think. It involves you because it's double-handed and it's really quite different in feel. And so it's a completely different way of feeling about using the computer. And it's a machine for sitting and reading. And of course I've just realised I can't spell. Not to worry. So there's another view of this navigational device. And you can see that it just displays standard web type of sites or CD-ROM stuff or anything. And I was running the Brain Project site on it. So then we'll talk briefly about some equipment that I built for... What's happened to my spelling? That's bizarre. It's never been like that before. I think my brain seized somewhere in all of the production of this. Not to worry. Yes, it should be Hayes Express. And these are works that I assisted Christos Somera and Laura Mignonnet in the production of. I built the large-scale interface hardware for them. This is the window in a European train, or at least that's the emulation. It's the metaphor. So you're sitting in the seats, the standard European train box. You've got the seats facing each other, and in side to side with the window, and the little sort of drink table and so on. But out through the window is a synthesized or computer-generated stream of stuff produced by Laura Mignonnet. And when you place, as you can see this guy's doing here, your hands in the screen area, the computer knows where the hand is, so that if you push your hand across the screen, then it's as though you're pushing the things in the screen away, so that they sort of stream away from you with it. Or if you wave your hand around, they sort of... So it's as though you're... If you imagine yourself in a room full of dandelion seeds or something like that, and apart from the problem of the hay fever, if you push your hand through it, they all just kind of stream away and get turbulent and all of that sort of stuff. And the computer images emulated that kind of behaviour. And they're being sensed by a set of infrared LEDs and receivers around the screen. This is another, somebody else using it. They may well, no, last year they had a different version called Riding the Net, right, which is actually mentioned here as well. Yes, so you may have, of course, I'm bringing coals to Newcastle here, it's, you may well have already come across this stuff, yes. This is that screen in construction, and you can see sort of vaguely along here all the sensors and the emitters, the infrared emitters and the detectors. That's the interface software, hardware for it. It reads the detectors and tells them when they're being blocked. Tells the computer when they're being blocked and stuff. So,
how did you come to collaborate with Chris Moran?
Through a consciousness reframe conference in London, in Wales in '98. Was it '98? Yeah, at the interstices thing down at Port Elliot there.
Oh, is this patent spending?
Actually, there is on this, yeah.
Yeah, Laura mentioned it.
Yeah. Not that I think that there's any patentable objects in it, but that's another matter entirely. Anyway, this is how it works. You've got essentially infrared LEDs. Basically, it's just a series of TV remote controls spaced at regular intervals across the top of the screen or down one side of the screen. And TVs, receivers at the other end, which are receiving the signal from the remote. So that's exactly what it is. And or, if you will, it's a screen about about 2/3 of the size area of that whiteboard over there. And it can sense where you are in the screen. So it's really just a touch screen blown up to a very large scale with a fairly, in a sense, not very sophisticated kind of sensor system. But what we did to make it more interesting is that we made it statistical, so that it only ever checked every third or fourth row. So the problem was we had to speed it up because it's actually quite the emitter detector relationship is quite slow. So, and there's a lot of them, so we had to speed it up. So we made it, we run one in every n things, and if there was some sort of event there, then it would start to hunt around that area rather than having to regularly rescan the whole region. And then we come to Riding the Net, which, as I say, you've probably already seen. But the point about this is exactly the same technology. Implemented very slightly differently. This was the second time around the loop, so we got it a little bit more sophisticated. And this is the way in which the interface technically worked, electronically worked. And it got the data from the Windows, and it then talked to the computer through a standard serial interface. And Riding the Net also had speech recognition capabilities using ViaVoice, and it was this version of it, and I suppose that the one that they showed at SIGGRAPH was much the same. Used the internet as a source of imagery, which would then be streamed across the screen. And you could do this same thing as I talked about with Haze Express, where you could push the images around. The other thing that was more interesting with it is that you could pick an image and you could place it. So you could sort of go up to, I'll do it this way. You could go up to an image and you could stop that image. The rest of them are all continue to flow around you, and they're all images that somehow relate to the key word that's been picked up by the speech recognition. And of course the speech recognition is not necessarily very reliable, so it gets some pretty weird keywords at times. But and then you can place that image in some location and fix it, so that what they were proposing and are still producing is a kind of large-scale sort of interactive notepad where people could gather around. It's a bit like your Immersidesk kind of stuff that the Visualization Lab in Chicago built. You could place something on the whiteboard, on the screen, and actually build up a series of conversations around that, and you know, so people could use it as a way of actually interacting with each other about a chosen topic, about a problem, or about some kind of development idea or something like that. This is another of theirs. I also built all the interfacing for this. This flashlight here has a video camera in it, colorimetry, broad colorimetry sensing in it, distance sensing, and switches in it that allow it to tell whether it's actually being held by somebody, which could be used for triggering other events as well. And then it could, depending on the distance that the camera was from a person or some surface, it would either show you the camera image, or it would come across to this kind of abstract imagery. And there was sort of variously some sort of intervening stage. So you got a mix, depending on a mix of the camera versus the synthesized images, or the computer-generated images, being controlled by the distance of the camera from the person's face or whatever they were pointing it at. Here were the three miscreants, and you can't actually see really very clearly what the imagery was, but it's a really lovely. What Krista and Lauren are working with is artificial life generated images, evolutionary imagery, and each of the well, they're impossible to see the details, but actually maybe we go back to that one. You can see each of these glowing things here is actually, in a sense, a little computational creature, and the state of those creatures is determined by information coming up from the scanner, so that the scanner, the image is determined entirely in terms of its appearance by information coming off the camera scanner, the distance. The other thing that I forgot to mention with these scanners is that there's a Polhemus virtual reality sensor in there as well, and so the computer knows exactly in the room where the scanner is. So if you move it like that, all the image will flow in the same way. Well, this is how they arranged it. I mean, you can patch it any way you like, but that's how they patched it, so that if you moved it up and down, the images would all sort of flow up and then start to fall back down and things like that. It's a very beautiful piece.
Was it a 3D scanner? Did you glean 3D information?
We glean distance information to control the mix, but it's not a 3D camera. Right? It doesn't actually know what the sort of camera image spatial, stereoscopically is. Well, the Polhemus allows you 3D space, so if you move it back and forth, then you'll get a zoom in the imagery.
Right, but it's more like one point of the zoom. It's not a 3D. You're not making. You get the difference.
Yeah, no, it's not. I mean, it's just it's just a single point that's moving around. So it's, in a sense, it's an eye looking at the world.
I remember that when
Where did you see it? In Berlin?
Yeah.
The video image was almost completely taken out in the Berlin version. The curators there didn't like the way the video images were handled, and they asked for it to be removed. So we did it. You know. I mean, whatever it costs to implement, they're not going to argue with the. Well, the point was that the distance would have controlled the mix between the live image, the camera image, and the computer-generated image.
So when it's very close, it's totally computer-generated.
That's right, yeah. So that when it's at about that sort of distance, then you'll get the camera image, and as you come closer, you'll get the generated image being sort of mixed in over the sort of surface of the camera image.
Why is it called Pico-Scan?
A small scanner. Don't ask me.
What was the idea? I mean, let's say more conceptual idea in the first place. Actually, using the idea about the face and then the.
Well, I think the original.
Abstraction.
I mean, I can't really answer for Laurent on this, but my view of it is you know, from conversations and so on that we had, was that really what they were trying to do was to gather information about the viewer, the audience, and the space in which they were, to control the parameters, the colour and shape and size and motion and filigreyness and so on of the artificial life organisms, visual entities that they were producing. So, you know, they.
Kind of like an abstract mirror.
Very, very abstract mirror. Yeah. And then these are installation shots of it in Berlin, and it's. I don't actually have a shot of the final installation.
Can I have one question? When they did the one shown in the museum photography in Tokyo,
Yeah.
and others, they used video camera to determine the distance from the screen. And why? What is the reason that if this it is polyamorous, that's can be distance instead of using digital camera?
Which was that piece?
France, for example.
Oh, that's they're like the ICC piece.
France was shown at museum photography.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
the other piece as well, when an image of the visitors was sort of positioned in the screen, it was a video camera from the ceiling that detected the screen.
I think the main reason was that the optic flow type of techniques of detection like that are quite slow, whereas the Polhemus can be much more quick. And they wanted 5 or 6 scanners. They wanted like a thing that a number of people could use at once. And so these were partly at least driven by the need to speed the process up.
And then don't you get pitch and yaw as well?
With you get a much wider range of signals of data off the Polhemus sensor as well. Anyway, that's an overview, and basically that was it. So I hope I've entertained you to some extent.
I have a question.
Yeah, please, any questions?
Kind of a dreaded question, actually.
Dreaded from your part or dreaded from mine?
In general, the idea of virtual, when you see where I'm going, right? When you started talking, you said something that I find interesting as a concept, that this reality is virtual, that we construct, etc. And that the second order virtual is virtual reality that's immersive. But then you did something towards the end of your lecture by saying non-virtual reality, talking about ubiquitous computing, which I find
Okay.
very contradictory.
What I meant was non-second order when I said that, yeah.
But then I have to challenge you, because I would say if the first order of virtual reality, for lack of a better word,
Yeah, okay.
this,
Where are we? Where was it?
then I would say the second order
All right. Well, I mean, I haven't done a proper taxonomy of virtual reality. No, that's
Do you know what I mean? I mean, you're basically...
what I guess probably what's happening here is that I'm actually trying to use the word virtual in two different ways. One, to talk about these orders of virtuality as opposed to reality. And then what I've done here is that I've slipped into the sort of usual thing. I've swapped paradigms and I'm now in another, and I'm really just talking about actual real sensing of the environment and its use to as opposed to interfaces which appear on the screen and which are sort of touchable and things like that on the screen. So I mean, you're picking up a loose use of terms rather than any kind of real sort of trying to make a distinction, you know.
I would actually go back again to what you said first.
All right. Well, basically,
Because
you
in a way,
have we have no way of. I mean, the sort of the summary of that problem, that question is, we have no way of knowing what it is that is out there. Everything that we know is a mediated and in
that's agreed.
yeah, and so the world of that we consider real, you know, is only exists in here.
So to say, it's a semiotic construct.
It's a construct built out of meaning and experience and the accumulated history of the world of knowledge and experience, and i.e. built out of the culture.
Right.
And so whatever is actually going on out there is the subject of quantum physics in the Western world and the subject of other kinds of conceptualizations of the world in other cultures. But in our world, it's actually unknowable. We can make inferences about it, as we do with physics, but we have no access to it in any real, in any sense that we would normally think of as being a real direct connection to that stuff, whatever the hell it is.
When it comes to the taxonomy, another issue is that can we use this word virtual? There's been a lot of discussion.
Well, it does rather dissolve once you start doing this, yeah.
That it is practically real,
That's right.
and it
That's right.
involves this real
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. No, I think there's probably a lot of work, philosophical work, that has to be done on this whole issue of virtuality. I mean, I think, like, part of this comes from a reaction to Baudrillard, in that I think Baudrillard simply totally failed to understand what he was thinking about. Because his whole idea about simulacra of the world was really just, we're in simulacra all the time. The Catholic Church has been the best virtual reality generator that we've had in the last 2,000 years.
But there is something
You know.
to be said, not to disagree with that, but to go back to ubiquitous computing and extending out into networks and experiencing reality in a different way through sensing the environment and having artists and designers amplify thinking about your environment differently. The way our mass mediation works now is different from what the Catholic Church was doing. It's not as localized. Even though you could argue that yes, it's beyond the speed you're talking about when you're talking about mimetically kind of duplicating and endlessly replicating ideas is very different.
Yeah, I don't
think there was ever a time that we're aware of on this planet when
the mass of it, the speed of it, all of those things, but they're parameters. They're not structural.
But they're very real parameters.
Oh, well, absolutely. No, I mean, I think that there's a massive amount of more
That actually,
stuff being pushed into it, but nevertheless, to to a person in the village in the 11th century who knew only of, a day's walk. All their world consisted of a radius of a day's walk from their own home, or whatever it might be. The greatest extent of their world would be the pilgrimage that they could make once every 10 years or something to some site, maybe a month's walk away. They nevertheless had an immensely full world, full of, but the speed and stuff was as intense and as direct and as fast for them in their experience as it is now for us in our experience. I don't think it's changed structurally. I think the parameters are now bigger, but I don't think that there's a great deal of new actual organisational or structural accumulation. I mean, that's a debatable issue, but that's a place I would start.
How would you then answer the argument, not mine, but the one that's out there, that painting is equally immersive?
I think books are seriously immersive.
But it kind of contradicts your order of what's immersive and what's not.
Well, that's.
In other words, really it's about your consciousness, whether you're able to immerse yourself in this, or you can't focus yourself at all because,
you're so distracted, yeah.
I see people on keyboard totally immersed for hours and hours
and
hours on the move. So that to me is immersive.
Okay.
Even though the interface is ugly and
Right.
stupid,
But, all right, well, the point I'm trying to make is that immersion is about this absorption. It's about forgetting the rest of stuff.
But is that the point I'm trying to push at?
Yeah.
Is that about the equipment, or is it about your mind?
It's about your mind.
Right. So you can't say, you have virtual reality, therefore you're able to immerse yourself. You could put somebody in Cher's piece who totally doesn't get immersed, and the experience can be different.
It'd be pretty hard, but.
I actually know people who hated
Really?
it. Absolutely.
Wow. Okay.
I know people who absolutely hated it and couldn't wait to get
Really?
out of it.
Okay. Well, fair enough. But no, what I'm talking about is I'm talking about immersion, and all of this stuff is about your consciousness. It's about your experience, not about the media, whatever they are, the technologies that you're using.
That's what
Yeah.
I'd like you to elaborate on a little bit.
One question which is related to that is, I think you mentioned that the way we know the world is always mediated. And when it comes to this notion or definition of media or to be mediated, the problem is the way our body is by itself, our sensory organs included as this media in your definition, or media usually means something outside.
No, I include the senses, our eyes, ears, the touch, the whole thing as part of the mediation.
So I think you are saying that it's in a way it's beyond language.
Well, it's well, no. I mean, I think that.
that whatever even if it's very tactile, so it has to be kind of signified to us somehow. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's not. You've got to be careful when you make a statement along the lines of it's something being beyond language, because
No, me. So it's mediated by language.
that's the point I'm trying to say. Yes, exactly. That what we know, the way we know these things, the way we interpret what it is that we experience, is through the linguistic structure, that the culture that we've grown up in, so that somebody else from another kind of culture is going to see this in a totally different way.
This is a difficult argument because how animals?
Sorry?
Animals, they know environment, but most of them might not have language. But they know
Well, no, but I'm using a very abstract sense of language, perhaps. I would have said that, okay, it's not so much language then, it's more like significance. And significance is a biologically It's a biological function, almost.
I think it's a sum of all different kinds of qualities of knowledge.
Well, that's what we use, yeah, and it may well be the way, I mean, an animal is not going to interpret any particular sensory event as an isolated event. They're going to interpret it in terms of all of the stuff that is their autopoietic condition at the time, and so they're it's going to be always interpreted within the context, whatever the context is. Now, I think it would be very misleading to say that animals don't have memory, for example. So that if they've got memory, assuming that, and I would assume that most creatures have memory, because at least if it's only biological memory in the sense that they experienced this before and all sorts of nasty things occurred, so they're going to remember and they're going to stay out of the way, that is a contextual thing which gives them a basis for the meaning of the new event, or in other words, for the significance of this new event, whatever it is at the time.
Because my sort of understanding is, according to the recent studies, there are less and less how to the distinction between the way the animals or the kind of lower level of animals recognize the environment, react to that, and sometimes convey the knowledge to others, and the way we use our central organ and our say cognition and get information. I think it's very continuous in gradation. And then it comes with another question, like direct touch with my fingers, or something like this, or indirect touch, like using telepresence. And so what will you difference? So I think this kind of definition is not so easy.
Well, if they're indirect touch, if the sensing of the indirect is as clear as the sensing of the direct, then what is the difference? None, or very little, other than you know that you've got this.
Before, say, because of this non-real-timeness, it was very easy to distinguish between.
Oh well, when there's a latency, you lose the immersion. You see, that's the point about the immersion in a sense. When there's a latency, you lose the immersivity. You lose that directness that is our illusion of being in the world and being in the real world. And you have this intervening latency, this time that it took for the damn thing to respond properly.
Yeah, but then you have the imagination, which is also virtual, or latency becomes really interesting. And I would actually add on to Machiko's, one of the big issues that we always come to in this class is language, in fact, when you deal with consciousness, and particularly with issues of global consciousness or globalization, which generally is kind of a corporate idea, but what if, using this technology as we become aware, how would you communicate with people in China, for instance? Not only do you have issues of latency and time, but you have issues of language. And when you're connecting the idea of kind of animal and us to animals, you're dealing with a human animal, and they actually are, for lack of a better word, universal language traits such as emotions, as fear, laughter, love, touch, and just like the basic, if you find yourself in a brush fire, doesn't matter where
Get the hell out of the way, yeah.
You experience the same kind of emotion, whether you're, whatever your civilization experience is. So I think there's so much to be really thought about here when these ideas of virtual and non-virtual are expressed, and the idea of real time to me is a big issue. What does that really mean? And why does it matter if you perceive time as delayed? Why is that not as real as when it's in real time? And sometimes real time actually takes away from your layering of experience.
I think the problem is there's this term immersion, which is a historical nomenclature that goes with a certain kind of virtual, that's the way it's constructed. And experience, which is more what you're really talking about, which is an experience that has us go into it. And often the initial virtual reality is immersive on both of those levels. But I think what you're more talking about now is kind of mixed reality. It has real-time updating based on sense. That's mixing in the environment with other kinds of things. So the latency in the real-time, the latency in the immersive, the old nomenclature of I'm wearing goggles is very disruptive. But what you're saying is that there can be media experiences that are not real-time, that are experiential. I think that's a very important thing. And in fact, I think that's what Laurent and they're actually pulling all these fragments of image experience off the internet.
With writing the net.
Right.
Yeah. You're pulling at fairly fine distinctions over the issue of real time. I mean, no, there is no such thing as real time,
Right.
if you will, because there's always the latency through the system. I mean, it may be pretty minimal,
Operational real time.
but operational real time is, within a couple of 100 milliseconds of the event. The real time, or the lack of real time, or the latency, that you're talking about with large scale media, for example, is clearly seen, say, with these sort of the latest things of the video fame with the journalist in Kabul or wherever they are, and it takes 2 seconds for the question to get over there, and for them to respond, and the response to get back. So you get this gap between the anchor person's asking the question and the journalist's response, and that can be, I find that really frustrating. But I also know exactly what it is, whereas a hell of a lot of people have no idea what it is. So how they experience it must be very, it must be quite bewildering, it would seem to me. But I think that also there's we're talking about operationality. We're talking about an operational world. We can't actually get to some kind of absolute fixed definitions of... It's like trying to define intelligence or consciousness. All we can ever do is get an operational definition of it. And I've adopted certain sort of operational views of these, which I hope I managed to describe reasonably clearly. I've no doubt that all of them are highly debatable, and these are the sorts of things that what one has to do, and this is the sort of the philosophical task, in a sense, is to try and pin down these things, to build a taxonomy or something like that.
I have one issue or question with the use of the word forget in terms of the definition of immersion, because it occurs to me that if scientists succeed in creating some sort of AI, some sort of computer that can actually think, it will not forget, no matter what you do to it. That demonstrates a major assumption about the nature of the kind of AI that's going to be feasible, in that it's fixed in current types of technologies. I don't think we'll get that myself. Well, even if we don't get it as an extrapolation of today's technology, forgetting seems to be an emotional thing that humans experience, as opposed to...
Forgetting is clearing the way so that you've got more room to store what's coming, it seems to me. But nevertheless, also forgetting is the changing in the states of the neural network structure as it stands. And it doesn't have... we're now into a whole new ballgame about AI, but... And there are sort of two very divergent conceptions of how AI is going to happen. And I think the concept that is sort of, HAL in space in 2001 and all of that sort of AI is largely not going to be the way where AI really appears. That's just kind of like very, very large storage devices. But that's not the kind of forgetting what I was talking about. I was talking about forgetting in the sense that one loses oneself in the process, and you sort of... So again, you're now catching me out, perhaps on a loose use of words, that it's a forgetting which is about just simply not thinking about, not having a current consciousness of other things that are going on outside this room, for example. I mean, we're immersed in this conversation, and so whatever's going on outside it is we're forgotten, and that's the way I was using the term.
This is, this is the problem with your first level immersion. So if everything's immersion, so basically we are immersed in this first level world. So what is it that we are forgetting?
What's outside the walls?
No. I mean that on a more ontological level. So if the experience of living in the world with all the sensory input and things like that.
Okay, as I say,
that is immersion. So then what is it that we are forgetting?
No, you're right. You're right. In a strong sense, you're quite right. It's back to the issue of what I've done is that I've used certain kinds of words in an operational way, and so it's a loose use of language. Forgive me, I'm sorry, but you are quite right. Yes, exactly.
I think like what the big question is here we are, and here are these technologies, and how can we, no matter which of these we choose, make these very palpable, deep experiences that we might call immersive, irregardless of whether it's closed. I mean, don't you think that's really what you're...
I'm sorry, I missed the actual question.
That it doesn't...
But do you need technology at all?
Or maybe you don't need the technology, but certainly we're all using what I'm saying is that with this word immersion,
Yeah.
that maybe what we're trying to get at, especially all of us here, is how do we use certain kinds of technology to get at a deep experience, an experiential moment that sort of, maybe you use the term forgetting, but basically creates a context that you're deeply involved with. So you're not thinking about somebody walking by on the wall. I think that's the loose language.
That's what I'm pointing to, yeah. Sorry, you had a question, did you?
I think the point is that came out in the lecture is that it doesn't, it could be anything. It could be any technology. So it has a much deeper relationship to consciousness and how the technology and the consciousness make a functional.
Bill, after that, let's give the students also
Yeah,
a chance.
Yeah.
Faculty stealing the word from the students, which is not really right.
I think we've beaten the immersion thing to death a little bit.
Yeah, fair enough.
It seems to me as if that one word has been used to describe two different things, and that perhaps we need to suggest some kind of new word that encapsulates your original definition.
Okay, would you like to make that suggestion?
I couldn't suggest one, but
Or at least draw the distinction
well,
out?
the distinction as I see it is simply that your original definition of immersion was, to be immersed in something is to be engaged in an activity to the point that you forget. You forget your other concerns.
Yeah.
You forget about your worries and your fears.
Yeah.
But the other definition of immersion in terms of these technologies they're presenting is to be immersed or be engaged by a simulation of as you put it before, first order reality, so a second order reality, if you like. In other words, you are being, your senses are being stimulated by some sort of technology which is tricking them into believing that they are experiencing.
That's actually how I define my two orders of virtuality, in the sense that the first one is that thing that that immediacy, and the second one is technically or technologically mediated sensing.
But I think the key thing here is that when you talk about this second order reality or immersion or however you want to phrase it, it is to do with tricking your senses, and that's what it gets down to. Because before we were talking about latency issues, and I mean one thing that just occurred to me is that
when you talk about virtual reality latency, the big problem, of course, is that when it's all about the tracking, right? I mean, graphics,
Yeah,
for the most
exactly.
part, keep up. They're at 60 frames a second.
Yeah.
Our eyes are fine with that. But when you rotate your head, often the problem is that the image doesn't track as quickly as
That's the latency I'm talking about, particularly, yes.
And that's just because our neck muscles move way quicker than the system can handle. But
Yeah.
at the same time, I mean, I've been drunk before, and
And that produces a certain kind of latency as well, yes.
in the real world, I can feel if I have 6 pints of Guinness, I can feel that same.
True.
But that is a reality. That is a reality. And so if I were to go up to a computer system that had just the right amount of latency in it and was showing the images of the inside of the pub or however you want, that could be a simulation of an actual reality, even though the latency is factored in there. So what this gets at is that if you can successfully simulate these latencies that occur in first order real life, then your simulation, so to speak, is very compelling and engaging because it's taking advantage.
Okay, yeah. But I mean, mind you, the alcohol, in fact, is doing, essentially what it's doing is slowing your system down by...
And it's also, I mean, in terms of other drugs, they're actually stimulating your brain to, I mean, in case of hallucinogenic drugs, you are, I mean, in a way, that's a second order reality, right? Because you are experiencing something which isn't, of course we're getting into semantics here, but isn't necessarily real. And to qualify what's real, this is what I'm getting to.
Okay.
So to qualify what is real, what is a first order reality, I would argue that in many cases you might have to have a third party observer, because what you said before is that if you can match consistently without touching something, and so this to me feels very tactile. Okay? If you were to put a very, very microscopic invisible glove over my hand such that I couldn't see it, but it had motors and so on, and I could be tricked into thinking that I was touching something like that, then I, as the first person in this situation, would indeed believe that that was a first order reality. Okay? Much like I would when I would take mushrooms and believe that there's something next to me or something like that. I would be tricked into believing that that was a first order reality. The only way to really tell that it's not a first order reality is to have someone else show me that I'm wearing a glove. But I think that if you do bring in that third party, you can make a rock solid distinction between what is first order reality and what's second reality. And that goes into psychologists' roles in life to say this person is hallucinating or this person is experiencing paranoid delusions. Or
Well, I wonder if it isn't the task of your Zen master to actually say and pull down the wall, so to speak. You know, I mean.
But I think that once you do bring in a third party, that distinction can be made. I mean, the
They're
whole,
also wearing the glove.
unless they're really
Yeah.
But that really brings
Imagine
up
the-
another
the-
whole
So perhaps the idea is that we need everyone but one person could be tricked into this virtual reality.
Well, there is this philosophical conundrum called the problem of the other, in which how can you tell that that the rest of us are not, in fact, just your imagination, and that you are, in fact, not the only person in the whole universe. You
Yes,
know.
and that's
So, I mean, it gets you into all sorts of trouble there as well.
Dolores had a question, but she didn't have a chance to.
No, I was just I wanted to address this whole distinction about the different levels of first, second, third, fourth.
God, how many realities are we going to?
It seemed like it's just a shattering of perceptions. Here you are, if you immerse yourself in this environment, and it's completely broken once you're in this new environment. This thing about forgetting, do we really forget? Are we still holding on to some type of essence that we know we can't be fully immersed? I mean, could there be full immersion?
Well, I'm saying there is full immersion, yes. And that's what I call the first order stuff. At the moment, what I'm operationally calling the first order immersion.
I think it's something that we, though, as artists need to consider, because this technology will get to a point where we all percentages, right?
Well, I mean, this is why I'm bringing. This is why it's important to bring these kinds of questions up, because in fact you are going to be confronted with this kind of problem to some degree, at least.
And you know, what is our role? I mean, for example, there's a book written by Grant Naylor a while back there. It's called Better Than Life, and it's a tale in the future where these people are basically wearing these VR helmets, but they're embedded right into their brains, and they're experiencing basically a better than life reality.
What is that?
And they don't know that they're in it.
Yeah,
and so,
right. Yeah.
Meanwhile, their bodies are just withering away.
Yeah, well, this is the thesis of the Matrix, isn't it? After all, as well.
If we presume that if we extrapolate the future, that this technology is going to get to the point that we could fool people, perhaps not everyone, but we could fool people, you know, then what is our role as an artist? Do we have some sort of moral obligation to not allow people to get sucked into that sort of environment because they'll never want to leave, or you know?
Well, there's a very good Ray Bradbury story about this stuff called The Veldt, I think. Is that the name? Anyway, it's a game. The kids have a game room that they go into, and they don't appear for a couple of days, and the parents wander in, and eventually they find bodies and stuff on the, you know, I mean, it's a really, I read it when I was about sort of 13 or something. It was a fairly horrific story then. It's probably not improved. That potential, I mean, we are only now beginning, well, the West, I mean, I think the East, certain philosophies within the East discovered this quite a few thousand years ago, but we're sort of really only coming to this view these days, is that you know, this lack of access to the direct connection with the world, with the physical world, with physics, with whatever that is that physics describes, you know, the illusory nature of the world. And so it's a matter of one's own capacity to pull oneself out of this sort of situation. So it's a matter of how the bootstrap works. But the thing is that it also, you can get a point where where this kind of knowledge is actually quite disabling, in the sense that now you've got these two views of the world. You've got the real world to work in, and then you've got this knowledge that you are not in the real world at all, and that may well be quite confusing to some people, especially when, I mean, perhaps this is a way of thinking about schizophrenia, for example.
Yes.
Perhaps it's not. I mean, I would only draw that as a suggestion. But that kind of thing is and I mean, I think that in terms of the moral issue with respect to artists and the production of experiences, the production of subjectivities, the communication of subjectivities for others to experience is something which you have to engage your own moral sense over. And I'm already strongly horrified by certain kinds of work, which are which claim to be attempts to do highly political analyses of, say, the behaviour of soldiers in the Bosnian War, for example. And I'm talking about a specific work, which you won't know because it's an Australian work. But its indulgence in presenting you with that experience is, to me, quite unethical, because it is actually almost exulting in the horror of the experience that it's talking about. And I think that kind of thing is something that requires, you know, I mean, that's down to the individual artist to make this the view. And we're not talking about obscenity, however that might be defined by some political superstructure. We're just talking about the visceralness of certain kinds of presentation. And I think that needs to be very carefully concern.
I think this issue is extremely important. And on the field of media, I think we find quite interesting attempts as kind of like, shall we say, mediating between these concerns. So like, to a certain extent, sort of like maintaining, creating, playing with this idea about immersive environment in a technical sense, but at the same time, clearly kind of like introducing certain kind of principles of distanciations within that experience. And a very good example is the piece called World Skin by Maurice Benayoun and Jean-Baptiste Barrière, which used the cave, which is probably the most, in a technical sense, the most immersive sort of like interface situation, introducing an highly interactive work which raises this issue of war, the experience of war as sort of like a state, also state of mind probably, and then at the same time persisting on using 2D representations of those soldiers and those tanks within this three-dimensional environment in a pretty interesting way, which I definitely think raises these two sides at the same time in a highly complex manner. Just one example of the piece, which I think is able to, in a very convincing manner, as far as I see, to raise this moral and this ethical issue, which that Peter
In case of this World Skin, it's monochrome, and not only that those people in tanks and also airplanes are represented 2D images, but they are not moving.
Yeah,
so
they're like billboard images, cut out figures.
Very effective.
Well, you have a camera, right?
Yes.
Yeah, the interface is like tourists taking snapshots.
It's
and
really
changing the
powerful.
shadow.
We should actually show that.
It's a great
It's
piece.
really powerful. I mean, I would actually argue that it was one of the strongest VR pieces I've seen.
Right, well, I don't know it, so it's certainly... sadly, Australia doesn't get all these things very often, so...
You could get around.
I get around a bit, but, I mean, I try. But.
Also has to do with other things, like just a very short anecdote. So many years ago at SIGGRAPH, I went with Jeffrey, Jeffrey Shaw, who's an Australian artist. I went to see the cave when it was first shown. We queued there in the morning, so the show floor to get access to that place.
That was Chicago.
Yeah, Chicago.
Yeah, I was there. I couldn't get in. The queues were so long, I never got in. It was terrible.
Jeffrey, and then we went for have a coffee and to chat about this experience, which was new for both Jeffrey and myself. And during that conversation, Jeffrey sketched on the napkin his sort of like counter version of the cave. He said, "Well, I want to do the cave once in my life, but I want to do it differently." So he came up with this sort of like a cave-like structure where he totally denies this sort of like this fully immersive experience, and he instead introduces this tiny little image window, which is supposed to kind of travel and be kind of like connected with the user's motions and things like that, and that became his Eve actually years later. But anyway, so it was kind of interesting to see how such an artist who was highly conscious of these systems immediately reacts, so like turning it upside down and saying, well, this is something we have to, which is highly interesting, but which I don't want to provide to my audiences. I want to approach it differently, kind of turn it upside down, still sort of like raise this issue about immersion. I think it was just an anecdote, but I think it's an interesting one because it goes to this heart of this very important matter.
So virtual reality versus virtual environments. I mean, I think as artists, we don't need to play off of this realism aspect, that we can create a very different kind of environment that's very evocative.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, sure.
And part of the answer is the video game industry. I think that's a whole separate issue. But
Well, it's not that separate,
no, I mean,
really.
It's a whole other thread.
Okay, yeah.
But the fact that that some companies are doing dynamic simulations to figure out how liquid blood bounces
I know. It's a bit of a concern, frankly. Yes.
It's something that's fueled by supply and demand. I mean, there's enough 14-year-old boys out there who buy these games that the game industry is on a roll. And it's going to overtake, apparently in 2 years it will overtake the book industry. It already overtook Hollywood, the book industry in 2 years. It will be overtaken. So clearly this is something that, even though a game company is comprised of several hundred animators and artists and programmers, and it's as sort of more individual artists, we have a lot more creative control over these things. It's still something to consider that these behemoths and companies are.
Oh yeah. I think that there are all kinds of ethical issues that we're getting very close to.
The sense of reality or sense of being natural is something which has been already known in traditional animation, because even if it comes to animation, if there's something awkward, like movement, people notice it. But what people find natural or real or nice is different from the real physical object or say movement. So that's the reason why, of course, they do all kind of squash and stretch and also exaggeration to meet people's expectation. So the expectation is something very subjective, and also has very much to do with the culture and what people learn, memories, things like that. And this is the whole issue, all sort of issues that influence our sense of reality. And this is the thing that the people know in the animation and have been using for 100 years.
I'd like to comment on Pete's point. The distinction to me, when you talk about a truly immersive environment, I think of a holodeck, where you cannot, as a user, tell the difference between that and the outside world. And I step back and I think, well, what is the difference in that? And the difference to me is, well, someone can pull the plug. There's someone controlling it. And then if you expand on that definition and you say, well, if you were to define the difference between a first level and a second level of reality or something like that as being an outside intelligence controlling or whatever, then what would happen if someone were to create a virtual reality that was fully autonomous, that was an uncontrollable, self-modulating environment that was indistinguishable from reality? Would that transcend the boundaries?
I think so.
Well, you've got a number of science fiction examples of this. You've got The Matrix, you've got Dark City. Is that the Alex Proyas movie, Dark City? You've got things like Greg Bear's Slant. You've got the Rudy Rucker, Wetware.
Is the Matrix a first-order reality in your definition of the world?
Well, to those people experiencing it, that was their first-order reality. To the people who were trying to defeat the people who ran the Matrix, it was a second-order reality. Again, it's a matter of where the observer sits in the framework.
There is some value as well to placing ourselves in the shoes of a third-party observer. Take the Matrix is a great example. The guy was living a pretty normal life. Albeit he was a hacker and stuff, but he was living a pretty normal life. And then he was absolutely oblivious to the fact that there was something terrible in the world going on. That he was part of.
He was in first order reality, as far as he knew.
Should he just be left living his life oblivious to it, or should he just be plugged in? And I think it's better that he knows. So I think that we should constantly enable, allow.
I think that, in fact, is probably a very good basis from which to stand as an artist, is that you, in fact, one of your primary roles should be to bring people's attention to the disparities between, it's a highly political sort of issue, because you're now talking about, what is going on in this country, in the world, what is globalization, all of those kinds of issues. So that's, but we're now stepping into, and as they say to all tourists, never talk about religion and politics, so I'll leave it at that. Yes, exactly.
First one is virtual, second one is immersive, third one is interactive, fourth one is hallucination.
I think that should be a metaphor also. You could
qualities of awareness of first order experience. That, for example, take what's happening in Afghanistan. Maybe 3 years ago we weren't thinking about Afghanistan at all. And so to make a parallel between the Matrix, suddenly there's knowledge of this second order reality, which is actually all part of the first order.
And, yeah, I mean, it goes. People say that ignorance is bliss, but that doesn't mean that we're necessarily better people for being.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
The
Yeah.
whole idea that people in the Matrix were experiencing first order reality because if it was to happen that someone pulled their plug, they would die, and there was nothing in their first order reality that would hint at that occurrence.
That's right.
So it would be real for them.
Yeah, but so how come I mean, how do you know that there isn't somebody out there who's going to pull your plug at some point, I mean, I don't believe there is, but that's another matter. We're not going to talk about religion either. Okay, we are going to talk about religion. Thank you.
What came to my mind is, in Japan, also because of the influence from Chinese philosophy, just kind of saying life is but a dream, kind of sort of belief, it's just more or less continue, like must continue in Japanese culture, which means that people sort of try not to really make this distinction between this first
Yeah. Yeah.
level or
Yeah.
second level.
Yeah.
And I'm just feeling that might make a difference in when the way people deal with virtual reality, say film, comics, like that. So
Yeah.
it's not exactly directly religion, but
Yeah.
this kind of the way to see the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, that's a big point, because you have Christianity that's really the staple of the West that made the separation between matter and spirit, soul and body, and you're kind of dealing with this virtual, real, that dichotomy is part of this culture, which is black and white.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just
Yeah.
billions of shades of gray, and we're seeing 2 or 3.
I also make the point that sort of sprung from a slightly earlier comment is that, I think yours, that second order reality in fact is fully contained in first order reality. So that they're not separate things. One is contained in the other.
The screen you're looking at is still real.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that's important for you to say
You should,
when you introduce it.
Kate Hales talks a lot about that in terms of there's kind of the disembodied computer technology, where she always talks about how in order for the computer imagery to be instantiated, it's always very, very physical.
It's got to be embodied. Yeah.
Even if you're it's kind of virtual reality, it still has to be instantiated through this massive.
Well, that's always been the import of early papers of mine from Consciousness Reframed and things like that. It's that it's embodiment that is where it's at, so to speak. It's is there a glass of water or something available around here?
I think we grilled you in that.
Oh no, that's fine. That's what I came here for. I'm pleased to make myself available. It's nice to do.
Drink? Give you something to drink? Thank you.
And thanks for interacting and being responsive. I mean, that's good too.